All right. I'll go ahead and open us. Welcome to Sophomoros, a podcast where we come with our foolishness, and in the midst of that foolishness, seek it against the wisdom of Christ. I'm here with my cousin Kevin. Kevin and I get to see each other about once a year, and every time we see each other, we get into very long and interesting conversations, and Kevin is one of the people that I know who can relate things together at a rate and in a way that is just incredible. He's got just a vault of a mind. So I thought it'd be interesting to grab him onto the podcast and pick his brain on some things. So, Kevin, how you doing?
Oh, I'm feeling foolish.
What did you just say? You're
said
feeling coolish?
I'm feeling foolish.
Oh, foolish. I thought you said coolish. I was like, what does that mean? Where does that? It sounds like something one of those people would say that's like, yeah, I'm doing well, right? Like, they won't say I'm doing good because, like grammatical reasons. Because they're snobs. Are you one of those people, Kevin? Am I calling you out right now?
Okay, I have a philosophy with English, actually, in relation to this.
Of course you do.
So, so there are languages like French or many others, as far as I know, where they actually have like some old, usually males, sitting in an office that are like determining what is or is not the correct word for this language, and they're like actually
no way.
Yeah, and this is a thing. And they're usually like university professors or whatever. And in France, it's actually like a legal thing. So what these people determine is a French word. Legally now, in any legal documents, that word has to be used for that thing. So if they're like, we don't like the word refrigerator, and they come up with like a French-sounding version of that, now any legal documentation relating to a refrigerator has to use this French version.
No way.
Yeah, to maintain and preserve the language. English doesn't have this. We don't have people that are determining what is or is not English. And so what's English is, if you're using a lot of words that are traditionally considered English, and then you throw some other stuff in there, and it's another language or it's something you made up like Dr. Seuss or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's still English because you are using a word intending to convey meaning, and I am receiving that meaning. And whether that word or phrasing has existed prior to that moment doesn't matter as long as the communication happened successfully. And that's English.
Yeah. There's an element of jazz-like nature to English. Just kind of, like you said, the willingness to stick to the rules to a degree, and then to improvise for a good amount of it as well, to kind of throw in your own flourishes and allow the language to develop. I think it actually almost... Do you think that there's a tie-in between the American political philosophy and, like the Lockean liberal kind of each man's freedom, right? And the way that the language developed, at least in America?
I think more than just America. I mean, you look at a lot of British history, and there is really strong through lines of desires for independent thought and expression throughout much of the nation's history. I think we sort of received a fair bit of that, and in some ways you could say that the Revolutionary War was a philosophical continuation of a pattern of behavior that had been existing already for centuries in England. And so it's almost a fulfillment of that continued desire for greater freedom of expression and idea and independence that could only be allowed by separating yourselves by an ocean.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think it's also interesting if we think of, because this ties into a thing that I'm not sure. So in this country we have this whole thing of race and racism. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we are putting more weight on the color than on the sound. And what I mean by that is, if you go to the UK, up until recently, if you were listening to the BBC, the voice would be that sort of traditional, upper-class, posh English voice on the radio. Mm-hmm. That's all you would hear. And it's only within the last few decades that they have opened it up and allowed people with a broader array of British-style accents to be front-facing people, like on the TV or on the radio or doing podcasts, because there is this deep ingrained classism. It's not really tied to color, so you can't call it a race thing, but it's a class thing that dates back to their history of having multiple classes and the type of English you speak being determined by the class level order in society. I think we've developed that here, right? Like, I had a professor in college who said that he spent years intentionally altering his accent to remove any aspect of, like, his traditional Southern accent that he had.
Yeah.
Specifically because he knew that that would have a negative effect on his ability to get better jobs in the future. And that's something his parents told him to do. They're like, you need to do what you can to get rid of the accent we have because it will hold you back. And so I think that there's an aspect of the accent, and then also paired with, like, the choices of which words are paired with which words, that has created this sort of separation of cultures. So if you go to an African-American community anywhere in this country, you're going to find a lot of consistent overlap in the way that they phrase things and the way that they pronounce certain words. They don't say ask, they say axe, as a classic example, right? And I think that people pick up on that audio cue even without seeing the person, and then they have biases relating to that.
And it's the classic example too of, like, how your name appears on certain documents will have an impact on whether or not you get a job in the next job interview or whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, there's the classic example that an extremely high percentage relative to the general population of people in politics have two first names. Like, their last name is also a first name.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
Something about having a last name that could also be a first name in some part of our minds seems to be something we find trustworthy, which is really strange.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. So, okay, this is exactly what I'm talking about for the listener. Like, this kind of rabbit trailing and getting into very interesting, like, Kevin, I don't know how you keep all of this in your mind, but it is masterful. So, yeah, wow. So it almost makes me think, going back to the subject, there's this way in which, at least within the growing, you could say, like, intercultural and international vantage point of economic development, as the economy takes root in a more globalistic sense, it seems to me that the like new ethic of the day has to kind of be like what Paul says, but in a sort of boiled down and secular fashion, that you have to become all things to all people. Right, so the idea, it's not that your professor wanted to get rid of his accent so that he could leave his family. I'm sure when he was around his family, the accent would kind of creep back in, and in fact, probably it would get him out of certain situations if he was using it in a certain context, right? Because you don't want to be ostracized on the other side either, from the people that raised you. But I think that, like, it's almost like gaining a skill in being able to mute the certain rough edges of your personality, whether they be from, what you might call a lower or upper class milieu.
Yeah, and this is something I've struggled with, especially with that verse and the culture we live in, is finding that combination that is authentically myself. Because partly that's a societally valued, be yourself sort of thing, but also because I think that truly forcing and molding yourself entirely into just some other being than what is, because like if you think about, yes, we are trying to become more Christ-like, but we are not trying to become God. We are trying to become like God. God formed us in our mother's wombs. So those unique aspects of ourselves that might be slightly different from God, but are nonetheless still holy because they are created by him, are still good things. And you want to be true and authentic to those things. But at the same time, like, how do you also then go and don't feel like every conversation you have with someone is you preaching a sermon?
Right.
And so it's that balance. For me, I do have this sort of love of the English language. And so I try to pull words and phrases from across the tapestry of time and location of the English language into everyday speech. So I will use the word y'all, even though I'm not from the South, because it's a wonderful word.
Yes. And it's one that's needed in our English language. It's been, like, dropped. You know, it's in a lot of other languages and not there.
Exactly.
Us.
So there's nothing wrong with bringing it in. But then sometimes I'll use more, like, classical, almost borderline Shakespearean language if I want to sort of feel in the moment that I want to create this or beautiful tapestry of language that people can suck at the nipple of, just to make it weird for you.
Oh my gosh. I have to cut that out. No,
you don't.
No, because that's natural. That's part of our creatureliness. We all, well, not all of us, but many of us sucked at the nipples of our mothers. And so
and everyone has them, men and women.
Yes.
Why men have them, I don't know.
Maybe that needs to be our next topic. No, I'm just kidding. See, we can find these maneuverings.
I'm just saying, not everyone has a belly button, but everyone has nipples.
Yes.
I hope.
And I would like neither. I would, I'm cool if we could just get rid of all of that, just like a marshmallow body, right? Just no indentations, perfect and smooth. So yeah, no, I going back to the idea of, like, almost drawing from a wide swath of human linguistic inheritance in order to bolster your ability to speak to different audiences at different times. I think this kind of begins to broach into a conversation that's been being had, and I'm sure that you kind of were introduced to this at least a little bit at Whitworth, because that's where you graduated from, yeah?
Yes.
So the conversation of how we avoid, as white Christians, bringing whiteness as bringing kind of the American dream into our evangelistic opportunities, so that when we're doing mission work or when we're evangelizing, we're not making our way of life one of the qualifiers for salvation or even just proper ecclesiastical practice.
Yeah, I mean, the American dream is something that has evolved over time.
Sure.
And it is oftentimes more of a pop culture dream than it is a lived reality by anyone. That on a certain level, it's a hope or a strive for sort of a thing. But I think for much of its history, and probably still today, the American dream, it does not overlap directly with the heavenly dream.
No.
We do tend to get those mixed up, and I think the goal is in our minds that we need to be remembering that our citizenship of this country, I mean, it would be really hard, but in theory it could be revoked. We could lose it somehow. We could, if we wanted to, we could pay to have it removed. But because we are washed clean by the blood of Christ, our citizenship in heaven is guaranteed. It's locked in. It's not something that's going to be taken away from us. And that's where our true eternal citizenship is. That is our primary country. Like, if you were to be a person that had more than one citizenship, but you had, like, country of residency. For us, it's not the United States. It's the kingdom of heaven. That's our country of residency. Yeah, we happen to be sojourning here in the United States or whatever country you happen to be listening to this from. but that is not actually your primary residence. It is the kingdom of heaven, and we have to keep that in our minds and look at what is a heaven-like lifestyle like, and that's the lifestyle we try to live. It's not usually sort of deep in practical termed one in terms of I'm going to have this percentage of savings and do that sort of thing, and I want my yard to look like this. That's not the lifestyle that a heavenly person is looking at. It's more of a mindset, but that mindset leads to lifestyle, which also then leads back into mindset.
Yeah, and I would even say beyond mindset, it's credo, right? It's how you choose to address the world as a person among people, what you choose to believe about your neighbor and what you choose to believe about the God who made your neighbor, that will kind of dictate how you live and act. Just to kind of take it, maybe that's just making it a little bit too Kantian, but I do think that it's important that it's not just a mindset, because mindset is something that oftentimes has sort of a, at least in our culture, it's like kind of this veneer of fakeness around it, right? Like it's like you just have to have a positive mindset. That's basically just like tell yourself things are going well so that they are in your head. It's like fool yourself. But it's it boils down to the level of belief, which to me, maybe it's because I've studied dogmatics too much at this point, but belief almost sounds more robust to me than mindset. Belief is what you frame your life around, regardless of how you feel at the given moment, or regardless of how what you may encounter to the opposite. It's your firm footing, right? It's your foundation. And but anyways,
I think
that could be a whole other topic.
Well, and I think that's interesting too in the context of the modern age. I feel like for in the pop culture, belief is just that thing you happen to have off to the side. It's not the core part of who you are. And I think you could argue that within the secular community, a belief that is a foundation of your being is like such a alien concept that they don't even really know how to conceptualize it in their minds. It just doesn't compute.
Right, because truth has to be common. Truth has to be able to be verified by all.
Well, yeah, except then you run into what is truth.
Right, exactly. That's basically. I mean, it's basically empiricism when you frame it that way, right? When it must be accessible by all. Or I guess you could maybe put it in rationalism, but even rationalism would have some caveats, I guess, with that.
I mean, I do think there is a very clear standard by which we can imperially measure what truth is, and that is God.
Okay, say more about that. I might disagree with you, but let's see.
I think that, and this is also sort of a broad trend of things like truth or love or justice. These are attributes of God. To understand what they truly are, instead of just what we conceive of them to be, we have to measure them against God. Now, that doesn't mean that if we understand love, therefore we understand God. No, because he is much broader and bigger than just love. But in order for us to measure and understand what love is, we must look to God.
Yeah. Yeah, no, actually, I would agree with that. I agree with that. You almost have to enter into the, like, are you familiar with, like, apophatic, approach to theology?
Maybe, but I'm really bad with terms and definitions.
Basically it's negative theology. It's the idea of like, well, we know what God isn't, and that's how we'll define him. We use what he isn't as it creates a silhouette of what God might look like by slowly blocking out what he isn't. And so a good example of this would be like, God is love, but God is not the love that, human beings exhibit for one another in a creaturely sense. God is beyond that love. So that gives us a look into something that is, it's like it seizes upon an icon, right, or a symbol, but then it makes clear and makes important the notion that symbol does not connote the God that we're talking about. It isn't the same as that God. It may bring our minds to that God in as clear a way as we're capable of, but then we have to make the distinction that that God is beyond that, right? So I think in that sense, I think the view that like God is beyond love, right? So he is love. God is love. But if your first notion of love is what you as a creature conceive of as love, then you might be being misled in your understanding of love, because you're using a symbol that is creaturely to describe something that is external to creaturely reality.
Yes, I think that's exactly it, and that's also where people run into trouble. I think is this tendency to end up worshiping the attributes of God instead of God Himself. So we understand that we define what true love is by looking at God, but then we decide to fixate on love, and to the detriment of our understanding of love, and to our detriment of the understanding of God, and we start to worship love instead of God, which is idolatry, or
right.
In other communities, it's called a fetish.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
We understand inherently that people that really can only find pleasure in feet, that something has gone wrong. And yet we don't have this same understanding that something's gone wrong when all people do is obsess over love and no other part of God.
It is interesting. And do you think that can also expand out to the titles that are given? So like God as Father, or God as the bridegroom, or God as the teacher or the shepherd, right? Like can this go farther, where if somebody's unwilling to branch out in their labeling of God, unwilling to admit all of the titles, then they're sort of condensing their vision of God in an unhealthy way?
You could say that, or that our worshiping of like, even if you... So, like, the classic argument that the Jews have for Christians is that we are actually polytheists instead of monotheists, because we have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so if we worship each of those individually to excess, then that argument actually ends up becoming true.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna move into an idea that I've been pretty captured by recently, and it comes out of Barton Bonhoeffer, and I think it might be a key to creating a notion of what Christian truth is beyond just abstract notions. So Barton Bonhoeffer, and you have some history with Barton Bonhoeffer, yeah? I mean,
More
I think you were the one
side,
that kind of
yes.
You kind of put me on to the two of them as keys for me. I remember the conversations. I think you came to visit me while I was in college, and you were like, "Have you read any Bart yet?" And I was like, "No." And you were like, "Yeah, you got to read some Bart." It's like,
well,
okay.
Anyone that
All
enjoys Lewis but wants more systematic theology, well, you need to check out Bart. Like, he's a great parent.
Yeah. That's interesting, especially given that C.S. Lewis was much more open to natural theology than Bart. But yes, there's a similar linguistic kind of, like, neither of them sound in a lot of their popular writings as if they're trying to be like overly academic. Both of them are theologians for the church, I would say, and that kind of gives them a nice, like, Bart can be a little complicated to read, especially out of context, but if you read him in context, he has this kind of almost symphonic way of writing, where he kind of does these like ellipses around whatever he's talking about, batting away all the things that it couldn't be before he gets to the thing that it is. And the way he says it is very, like, it's been described as sermonic, right? Like, it has this kind of this gravitas to it, that pulls in the reader. He's really fun to read. But anyways, okay, so from Barton Bonhoeffer, I got this notion that when we talk about God, we have to address God based off of his own revelation to us. We have to stop primarily defining God based off of attributes that are disembodied from God's revelation of himself. And so, heavily leaning into disembodied there, God has embodied himself, and in the person of Jesus has incarnated, and has shown us, at least according to Paul, the fullness, right? He is the perfect imprint, right? He is the image of the unseen God. So what was before unseen for us about God is seen in the person of Jesus, and that because Jesus is that revelation of God to us, he is the only place we can go to find like the truth about God. We can extrapolate from who Jesus is into these sort of attributes that we name and give him. But if they don't find their rooting in Jesus, then they might very well be the God of Plato or the God of Aristotle, but not the God of the Bible, right? And I think this is a really fascinating notion, because I think it completely regrounds our theology. It, like, especially given the moves of scholasticism to kind of integrate popular philosophy and the God, the kind of monadic God of the Greeks, into Christian theology. Like, I think this kind of gives Christian theology its own place to stand, right? On a place that is not someone else's soil. Does that make sense in the way that I'm explaining it?
I think possibly. We'll see.
Okay. Okay. But basically, so the idea then is, apophatic theology, the idea of, like, negating in order to get to what God truly is it makes sense if your God is, transcendent, which we do believe our God is transcendent. But then our transcendent God came to us in the manger and showed what it meant to be God by uniting himself to humanity. And so that, like, so specifically what it means for God to love humanity is for God to die for humanity. What it means for God to love humanity is for God to be with humanity in a way that would seem to contradict what it would mean to be God, right? To bridge the gap between the creator and the creature. So it's not us bridging that gap; it's God himself. But the gap has been bridged.
I suppose what I kept thinking of, especially at the beginning when you were talking about this, was you have seen and therefore you believe. Blessed are those who do not see and yet still believe.
Interesting. Okay, go into that more.
Well, that's what Jesus says to Thomas.
Sure.
And so that would imply that you cannot see and still believe. That the seeing of Jesus is not a necessary condition of faith. And
yes, but I don't think that you can. Let's say it this way. I think that it had Thomas never seen Jesus at all, I don't know that Jesus would have said that. But I think what he's trying to say there is you walked with me, right? And you heard the claims about my resurrection. And you you would not believe them to be true until you had seen me resurrected. But you could have believed before that, right? But I don't think that means that, like, there's some sort of separation where you could say, well, there is an unseen God that you can kind of believe in, and it'll get you close enough. Like, I think he's still locating himself as the way, truth, and life. I just think in that moment he's saying, like, remember I talked about this for, like, a long time, how I was going to die and raise, and you could have believed without seeing that it was true, but you had to have the facts, you had to have the proof, and that is not a strength, that's a weakness.
I guess more what I'm circling to is we've had, give or take 2,000 years of Christ's reign.
Mm-hmm.
And before that we had, I'd say minimum 4,000 years of human history, mm-hmm. in which God was still very much engaged with humanity, as we see through the Old Testament.
Sure.
And he was unseen through all of that time.
Well, so that's where I would actually say I don't think he was unseen. I don't think he was with the people to the same felt degree that he was when he was in the person of Jesus. But I do think that, like, in the same way that, like, Jesus is with us now, and yet we do not see him. But he works, and in his works we see him. And we come together as the body, and in that we see him. And the word is preached, and in that we see him. I still think that there is a proximity that Christ has to us that goes beyond what is visible. So this is where you almost do have to lean on your extrapolation of who God is in Jesus Christ. And you have to believe that now, and you have to, like you said, hone in on believing without seeing, because we don't have another option, right? But I think that it's the same God. Like, I don't think that the God of Israel and Jesus Christ are separate. I think that the God of Israel incarnated in Jesus. And I think that you could say, like, the manifestations of that God in Israel, so, like, the burning bush, the rock that follows them in the wilderness, the pillar of smoke and of fire, that they are that same impulse of God to manifest himself that later culminated in the coming of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe more broadly what I'm concerned with of this is I feel like we already have an unhealthy tendency in... Actually, it's circling back around to the worshiping of attributes of God. This is putting all of it on Christ and discounting the Spirit and the Father, and therefore God as a whole.
Yeah, I would push back on that, because I hold a pretty Augustinian understanding of the Trinity, where, like, there is no place in which you see one member of the Trinity, one person of the Trinity, where the other two are not present there as well.
Right.
And I think so. I think Jesus is the incarnation of the Son, but in him are the Spirit and the Father as well. And because he says that,
Right.
You've seen the Father, I am
why,
the Father, the Father is in me.
Why single out trying to figure out all of who God is through the Son and not the Spirit or the Father?
Because I don't think they're different gods. They're all one God. So where you see the Son, you see the Father, and you see the Spirit. So, like, I don't think that there is a separation in that way. Like, I don't think that where you see Jesus, you're not seeing the Spirit or the Father. I think you do see the Spirit and the Father because you're seeing Jesus. So you get the full of the Trinity.
I kind of get where you're at with this. I guess maybe it's just in your initial description of this, it was purely like Christ's New Testament focused, and that was kind of it, right? And so it felt like it was almost removing or discounting like the Old Testament almost in society,
Yeah,
which we
and
kind of have a bad habit of right now in the church,
absolutely.
especially in the States.
I am no fan of Marcion. Definitely, I would say that they equally testify to the person of Jesus, the Old and New Testament, one looking back, one looking forward. But I think that the New Testament gives us the eyes to see the Old Testament for what it truly is, right? Like that until Jesus comes on the scene, we don't know what the Old Testament is actually about.
Yeah.
But the Old Testament is all about Jesus. It all is pointing towards the Messiah. And once we have Jesus come and basically, walk the road to Emmaus with us and show us all the places in the scripture that that this was prophesied about, I think at that point we have a new understanding of what the Old Testament is. It's the passionate love of God for humanity that culminates in the coming of God to humanity in the person of Jesus for the sake of dying and rising to save them. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
You can't disconnect Christ from the God of the Old Testament. They are the same God. So and they can inform each other. I don't think that you could say that you have to read the New Testament before you can understand. Well, you do have to read the New Testament before you can understand the Old Testament, but neither has, I would say, primacy. Like you can, because the Old Testament, the way you read the Old Testament will influence the way that you read the New Testament, and vice versa. Like you could say they're in dialogue, in conversation with each other at all times. So all of this is kind of as a way of maybe escaping the fetishism that comes from abstracting one thing about God and loving that part of him. Because Jesus embodied, I would say, all of the different attributes we might give to God at different intervals in his life. Kind of like showing us through the looking glass these different things. And in order to get the whole picture of who Jesus is, you have to reckon with a lot of these attributes. He acts as kind of a regulating principle for theology. You can't stray too far from who God is if you're looking purely at Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yep, it absolutely does.
Cool. So anyways, that all to address the, that kind of that fetishization of certain attributes, which I feel like you do see constantly. And so like, when I was early on in college, I would have been a pretty hardcore like cage stage Calvinist, and I'm sure you remember those conversations, the rabid Calvinist conversations. But I think the thing that I was missing, like, it's not that I don't believe in God's sovereignty anymore. It's just that I believe that sovereignty looks different now. Like, there's an element of that sovereignty that has to be grounded in the manger, right? Like, what it means for God to be powerful, what it means for God to be, overall, is the cross. And, like, I'm still kind of trying to reconcile what that even means for how I envision God's sovereignty. But like reading 1 Corinthians 1 and seeing that Christ crucified is the power and wisdom of God, like that turns everything upside down. It changes the way you see everything. It grounds it completely differently.
Yes. Very much so.
So you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you did. I think you kind of brought the whole thing around full circle. You did a good job.
Yay! We hit full circle. Yay! So Kevin, what have you been thinking about? That's been my major reconstruction in the past 2 years. Has been a radical recentralizing of my theology on the person of Jesus, and trying to and the God of the Old Testament, because again I don't think they're different, but basically looking to the Bible for my theology more than I'm looking to Plato.
Oh yeah, that's
and
fair.
And other abstracting philosophers. What has been your major What have you been thinking about recently in regards to who God is and what the church is in light of him?
Oh, that's a wonderfully broad and non-specific question.
I'm sorry.
And
you're welcome.
Reserve those thoughts for the shower.
Me too, man.
All the greatest moments of epiphany happen in the shower.
I know. How long of showers do you take, Kevin? I know this is
Probably
besides the
too
point.
long.
Dude, me too.
Yeah.
Me too. So when you
bath.
were growing up, though, you used to take the fastest showers ever. Like you'd be in and out in like 3 minutes, and I was like shocked.
That's just because it's being an only child. When you have the opportunity to spend dedicated time with another human being, you want to take advantage of every possible second, right? So
that's a good point.
That was just because I was hanging out with you. If it's just me, it's gonna be a good long time in the shower.
You're making me blush. Well, anyways, so
don't worry, it could have been anyone.
You're okay. All right.
Yeah.
Wow. Now I feel like a piece of meat. So you're a long shower like me. I feel like it's the one time that I know for a fact I can put my phone in the other room and, not be listening to a podcast or anything else and just like sink into the deep mire of thought. And it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And probably is running my gas bill way up the wall, but
Well, now that I have had time to distract you by coming up with something, I wouldn't say that this is this isn't a solved problem in my mind. This is an ongoing quandary, as it were.
Sure.
Which is so I think I've gotten quite good over the years because I've sort of dedicated mental effort to it, of not sort of holding grudges or great anger or frustration towards individuals. Like, I'll have it, but I'll generally be able to sort of, work through it and release it and not have that again, not letting the sun set on your anger, that sort of thing. Like, yeah, you're going to get upset sometimes, but it's not going to last. For people, I've gotten pretty good at that. I do not have that same sort of peace when it comes to institutions. And that's a complicated one for me because on the one hand, institutions are made up of people who I'm called to love. And yet I feel like oftentimes these collections of people, although they are not individually willing harm, are resulting in great detrimental harm and pain and suffering for many people around the world, sometimes including myself, quite actively sometimes for multiple weeks or months. Yeah. And part of that is like, I work for a company, right? Like that's the essence of working for a corporation, a for-profit entity. Like that's kind of the point of profitability is pushing the edge. But on the other hand, there are times where I'm just like, none of this makes sense. This is mad. No single person is wanting this, and yet here we are, and I don't know what to do with that anger.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a real man. See, I knew I could rely on you for something interesting to talk about in this. Man, that we could talk for a long time about that. Whether or not institutions are like warrant forgiveness, right?
Yeah.
Oh man.
I don't know. The people, obviously, yes, right? Like that's easy.
Yeah.
But when you have and now we add in things like computers and AI, and it's not even people making these decisions a lot of the time, and I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. And the more personal even computers get, the more you can easily get frustrated with them and and use them as a place to exercise your anger in you could say in the place of somebody who's human, right? You can still be exercising that same anger in the same way that like a psychopath might, you might start seeing the signs by them killing animals, even though it's not, they're not killing people. It's like, it's a place, it's an analog for the vile, human thoughts. That's interesting. Yeah. This also goes into that kind of almost that litigation question, or at least it's you could say it's an extrapolation of this question of like whether or not corporations are people, right?
From a legal standpoint, typically they are. From a practical standpoint, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Because what is the corporation outside of the people, outside of the will of the people? Like, what is it? Just the prolonged principles and laws that have been set in place by those people? Like, can you? Because at the same, in some sense, the policies, right, or the processes that end up hurting people the most in institutions are are made by people who are either long gone or long dead.
Yeah.
They're just the lasting, the lasting inheritance of people who founded the company or had a significant interest in it. Wow, that is a powerful question. I think this is why I'm so cautious about government.
Yes.
You and I think, share sentiments on this. I don't know where you're at now with this, but I think I'm at where you were at one point, and I wasn't there when we were originally talking about it. But like, I was a pretty hardcore libertarian at one point, and now I'm just kind of apolitical. Like, I've kind of resigned my engagement with the state at all, because I can't see past the notion that the government is, well, it's a monopoly on force, and I don't think force should ever be the Christian tool for creating change in the world. And so any engagement I have with the state ends up, I think, doing more harm than good in the long term. But it's the same question, right? Like, it's things that make sense in the short term that end up screwing people over in the long term. That get baked into the policies and the decisions and the infrastructure of different institutions. But I think that's my caution with government, is I think it is inherently impatient with people. Like, by nature, it wants to transform people or conform them into a certain image. And that's fine as long as that image is a good image. But if it's an image of what humanity should look like that's made in haste, that can be really detrimental in the long run.
No, I think that's pretty well said. I like that. What was it you were saying that it demands haste, or it it's impatient. It's intrinsically impatient.
It.
That government, some sort of parallel in my mind. Government is impatient and yet demands from us complete patience.
Yeah.
If the IRS calls you, they expect an immediate answer. If you call the IRS, good luck getting a response from them within the next 3 months.
Exactly, and yes, and I think that is a result of a non-natural human relationship to government. Like, you're basically interacting with an entity that has all of the chips. And in human relationships, that's never the case. We never run into people who have all the cards and we have none, right? and you could go with Hobbes and say, well, we've given them our cards. And it's like, yeah, well, maybe we shouldn't have. But anyways, I think it is unhuman the way that we interact with government, because in any human relationship there is negotiation based off of the different, you could say, powers that we have, right? So we recognize that we still want the person in our lives, but we also want certain aims and ends, and we utilize people as both means and ends. We recognize both. Whereas in government, the relationship between a person and government, it's almost like we are entirely means. We are entirely manipulated, and so seldom thought of as ends in ourselves. And I suppose you could say that, at least in governments like American government, there's a degree of response that we can have. Like, we can change the government, because the government is to some degree in our hands. But then there's also the question of whether those changes will happen in time for us, right? Like, there can be certain changes that need to happen on a dime, that if they don't happen on a dime could be, good for the next generation, but not really good for us. There's so many different what would you say, different axes on which the government is a dangerous game. But yeah, that's hard.
Managing human systems is an extremely complex process, and one could argue beyond the scope of any human.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily think it's a failing of humanity that we haven't succeeded in doing what is likely literally the impossible. I mean, how many of us spend our entire lives struggling to manage ourselves? We shouldn't be surprised that we're also therefore unable to manage the entirety of each other.
Yes.
At the same time, you can't just leave it up to each individual person, because we are all struggling with different things throughout the entirety of our lives. This is why we have government, to try to create some order, some structure that benefits us all as a whole, but you have the downside that some people are going to end up having a greater and unjustly proportional negative consequence of that attempt to make the majority of people's lives better. And that's assuming we have a semi-idealistic government that is, of the people for the people. That's not even looking at like a dictatorship.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like as you go further up the chain with government, the amount of control and also the amount of the amount of control you have goes down. Like my vote for president is essentially useless in the state of Oregon, because it's a very blue state when it comes to the electoral college system. My vote for city council members probably has quite a bit of weight, because I'm in a smallish town, and not everyone votes. So that actually has quite a big effect. And so it's, especially when it comes to local things, discussing them with each other, especially before you vote, so that you can get input from those around you in the community, and also give your input to them. Discussing that is something that has the real potential for change. And it feels much less like, government, and more like an actual community. Once you get to the really big, like, state, national stuff, all of a sudden it's just, one little drop in a massive ocean of voters and wills and ideas, and your ability to affect it is generally close to zero.
And it tends towards two basic and very caricaturized understanding of human good, at least in our system. Well, and others as well.
More so
right?
in ours than others, I think you could argue, because we have essentially a two-party system. Whereas others usually will have a multi-party system with two dominant sort of alliances. But those alliances change and adapt over time based off of the political whims of the nation. But you still usually end up with a we are for this camp and a we are against this camp.
Right. And so that makes sense of why it's two. It's polaric, right? Is polaric a word?
Well, circling back to the beginning of the discussion, it is now.
It is now, because I'm American and I decide what English is. So
which is one of the most American statements ever, if you think about.
Yes,
English.
Totally. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes, exactly. So the a thought that came to me while you were talking about that is, I wonder if there is an adequate analogy in the, is it, oh man, I'm gonna show my ignorance here. Is it the fifth commandment? Honor thy father and thy mother, for it shall go well with you in the land, right? I think there's something about that commandment that speaks to, you could almost, I don't know if demythologize is the right word, but like almost abstract it, and say there will always be, right, like the only reason that you would dishonor your parents is if you thought there were things that were good, there are things that are good that your parents don't think are good, right? That's the only way that you're going to get into a situation where you're dishonoring your parents. But the fact that it makes it that high up, that it's within the Decalogue, I think that you could almost say that it is a tendency for humanity to look upon those in authority over it and to not be patient with them, right? To want to change them.
It's called being a teenager.
It's called being a teenager, but I don't know that I think teenage years are where you begin to experience that lashing out against authority. But I don't know that we ever necessarily escape that. We do one of two things. We either basically we hate the authority for the rest of our lives, or we live in spite of it, I guess, or we try to become the authority, and we try to change what our parents did wrong. And you could say that's the politicians as well, that's the teachers, that's the that's all of the people in authority over us. We try to do something different in reaction against our parents. We seize authority in their stead. And I'm not sure whether either of those are noble. Obviously we have to take up authority at some point because somebody has to do it. But the reactionary, right? Like changing everything that the parents did because we didn't like it, oftentimes gets us into the opposite problem of whatever our parents were dealing with. So like you see this like quite simply in like spanking policies, right? Like I was spanked growing up, not often, but like on occasion. I know a lot of my friends were. I know my parents were. I know their parents were. And for some reason, spanking got kind of like it became ill-advised in parenting communities, probably in reaction against the parents who way over-abused that, right? And now all discipline seems cruel at all, right? And it's like, it's just the complete opposite. It's like antinomian, right? Just like do whatever you want. Parents are almost afraid of their children. It's gone the complete opposite direction. And I think all of that because we took up the mantle of authority and decided that our parents were stupid. We dishonored our parents, right? And our so maybe it's this, Kevin. Instead of, I think oftentimes one of the keys to forgiveness is finding that you yourself have the same problem in you that leads to the institutional problem or to the personal problem. The person who's whatever your enemy has in them is the same as what is in you. And there are times that you've done the same thing, right? So it's like that. It's the same thing as like being the parable of the guy being forgiven all of his debt and then, not forgiving the debt of his neighbor, right? So maybe the key is recognizing that, like, I couldn't run the government in a better way. I think that there are probably ideas that I have about how government should run that are bad ideas and that would get us into equal, if not greater, problems than the way the current government works. And almost having the patience, it's a similar patience as you have when you grow up and you realize your parents aren't perfect. And there's two ways you can go with that. You can either be like, aw, kind of pat on their head, like kind of almost condescend to your parents and say, like, I get it, you were trying your best, I don't agree with the way that you did this, that, or the other thing, but I get it, you're human as well, and I probably would have done the same thing in your situation. And then there's the other thing where it's like, I am the arbiter of truth, and you are stupid and ridiculous, and I will basically, I will usurp your power and change everything that you did. And I think, and obviously these are polaric as well. Again, hey, I'm using the word that I just invented. But maybe there's something in adopting that same sort of patience that we might have with our parents, with our governing authorities, in saying, like, these are difficult problems that they're trying to solve. And I probably would be I would be up the same creek that they are if I tried myself.
Yeah, I think that's pretty solid. It's usually where I end up with this as well. But it keeps coming back around for me.
Yeah. And you're in the heart of an institution, right? Like, in an institution that doesn't necessarily have any desires beyond profit making to make things better for the people that are working for them. I mean
the core of a for-profit business, I think by law, is that they actually have to try to make money.
Right.
I'm in the airline industry, so there's a big overlap with government.
Right.
I think if for no other reason than people, I don't know why people find flying concerning. We're all born floating. Like, why would a plane be?
Yeah, that's funny. That's an interesting parallel.
Inherently unnatural about human flight, and so stories and tales and the very big realities of airline crashes have an outsized sort of societal reaction. And that's resulted in a very long-standing history of strong safety at the core of pretty much everything relating to the airline industry, but also strong governmental oversight to ensure that it stays that way. So there is that sort of non-profit aspect of the safety side, which is also really strong. Right. At least, and I know everything is like, oh yeah, think safety or whatever. And so that's sort of like just an offhand for every industry, but the financial repercussions of a factory worker getting his arm chopped off by a machine, like, yeah, that's going to be a hit on profitability for that shop. But, like, it's not going to have a repercussion to every other factory in the country and possibly other factories in the world. But an airline goes down, like an airplane goes down, and it does have a large national and felt global effect on the entire industry. So there's just sort of that extra layer of consequence for someone screwing up, which is kind of unique in sort of the realm I'm at. But it also means you do have a lot more inefficiency, right? Because you have the inefficiencies of a bureaucracy, and then you have the inefficiencies of the bureaucracy of government on top of that. Which is sort of next level. So yeah, there's a lot of realms for frustration and limited abilities to change things, and so it keeps coming back up in my mind of like, oh my goodness, this is driving me nuts.
Yeah. Yeah, and as with any policy buildup, I think you get that eventual, like, this is ridiculous. We have so many rules, and the amount of profit that we are getting from these rules is not equivalent to the amount of energy that we're expending in following them. So maybe it would be helpful. What you work in the airline industry, but like, what is your specific role within that industry? What are you doing?
I mean, I'm at a small airport, so we do everything except fix fuel or fly. Like,
wow. Okay, so you're checking in people. You're at the ticketing booth.
We do the bags. We do the people. We de-ice in the winter. De-icing, by the way, if you ever like a lot of big airports, you can just do that as like a seasonal job in the winter. It is a lot of fun. I'm just going to throw that out
really?
there. As long as you don't mind, like, intense cold, it is so much fun.
That's funny.
And like, as long as I'm also saying, like, airports usually have the best views because all the trees have been cut down for the runway. So, like...
that's a good point.
And you're above all the planes and the buildings up there. It's very picturesque. It's wonderful. Yeah, so, it's all the things.
What does de-icing look like? Like, what do you do?
Basically, the idea is, so you've got sort of two processes relating to de-icing. The first part is the actual de-ice. Like you've got ice on a wing and you want to get rid of it. And the reason you want to get rid of it is like if you've ever been on a lake that hasn't had a Zamboni drive over it and make it all like super nice and smooth. Right, like it's bumpy. Like it may not look it, and then you put ice skates on, and all of a sudden you are feeling those bumps, right? Like you may not have seen it, but they were there. So it's that same thing on an aircraft wing, and it makes it makes the plane not want to go up, and that can be problematic. So the first step is you got to get rid of that ice. But then if it's a real bone chiller of a day, like the ice is gonna come back. So, especially if it's snowing. So you got this stuff that's called anti-ice, and if there's no ice there, and you put this stuff on, it like sticks to the wing, and it keeps ice from being able to build up.
Got it.
Yeah, and then it's all this like chemical stuff that's like specially designed, so when the aircraft takes off, it all just kind of like sloughs off during the takeoff process, and so by the time the aircraft's airborne, there's almost no goo left on the wings or the plane at all. It just kind of flies off because you don't want that extra weight.
What do you think about the chemical makeup of the anti-icing agent? Like, is that it hazardous?
People smoke it.
What?
It's mostly glycol. Both de-ice and anti-ice fluid is predominantly glycol, which is also the dominant liquid used in vapes and e-cigarettes.
Yes.
Like, I don't recommend you get some, like, type 1 or type 4 fluid and stick it in your vape and see what happens. Like, that's probably a really bad idea. The vast majority of this stuff is just glycol. So, it's actually pretty okay for the environment.
Here's my second question, which is, why do you know that? Why do you know what is in the de-icing agent? Did you look it up?
No, they teach you this stuff because they want you, because it's like you're gonna be spraying this stuff, and like there's a chance you end up breathing in through your mouth or something. Like you're gonna get it in. This stuff blows everywhere. And you're supposed to wear goggles, but people are idiots and they don't always do that, and then now it's in your eyes and like so. But yeah, I don't know of anyone that's gone blind or lost their voice because they got some de-ice fluid near their body parts. The only thing you don't want to do is the stuff that actually gets rid of the ice is like superheated. You do not want to touch that stuff directly. It will just burn you straight through. It's really hot. It's great though if it's cold out because you can hold the hose and kind of warm your hands up. It's nice.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Man. Well, we're nearing an hour 10,
Oh,
so
yeah.
I think I'll probably
Total
wrap
sidetrack,
things up. I
sorry.
mean, man, it goes so fast. Every time I podcast with people, I'm so shocked at how fast these things go. But thanks for coming on, and I'm definitely gonna have you on again if you're willing, Kevin,
Oh, yeah.
because
Oh, this was fun.
always love talking with you. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to Sophomoros this episode with me and Kevin, and we will see you guys again soon. May Christ be exalted.